제전벌 소dargye zon에 몸 쳔벌가 겨 바그르 다른 감산도 실물도 돈바테 제장나 계정자라는 저러 전이 장감서 저한테 기천을 지금 번조자라 소란데 언제 동반포를 신기로.
The supreme, profound and wondrous Dharma is difficult to encounter even in millions of eons. Now that we have the chance to hear and receive it, may we realize the Tathagata's true meaning. In order to liberate all sentient beings, please give rise to the supreme Bodhicitta. Next, we will continue to discuss the treatise on the middle way, composed by Master Nāgārjuna. Well, in entering the middle way, we are currently studying the realization of the Bodhisattva on the sixth bhumi. The central theme of this chapter is refuting what are called the four extremes of arising, and right now we are focusing specifically on refuting self-arising. To give you a sense of the structure, the section on refuting self-arising has two main parts. The first examines self-arising through the lens of Masters Bodhicitta and Nāgārjuna. The second looks at it through the reasoning of Nāgārjuna. Within this first part, the Bodhicitta and Nāgārjuna section, there are three aspects. First, refuting self-arising from the ultimate perspective. Second, refuting self-arising from the conventional perspective. And third, a brief summary. Those are the main divisions of the outline. Among these, refuting self-arising from the ultimate perspective has already been covered. Today we will discuss why self-arising is also untenable on the conventional level. This will be our main focus. Since the effect is seen after the cause ceases, even the worldly people don't accept them to be the same. Earlier we mentioned the Samkhya school, one of the ancient Indian philosophical traditions. They posit a primordial substance called Prakriti, an ultimately real self-existent principle. From this Prakriti, all conventional phenomena are said to arise. Because a single entity can give rise to phenomena of many different forms, the Samkhya school concludes that all phenomena are self-arising. In previous sessions we used several lines of reasoning to refute this view. For example, we examined what happens at the precise moment when the cause ceases and the effect arises. We also pointed out that self-arising is logically meaningless and that it leads to the absurd consequence of infinite arising. Through these arguments we have already refuted the Samkhya position. This means that once we examine things carefully, we cannot find any truly existent arising. This is what it means to say that arising is unfindable, ultimately. As for the conventional level, conventionally, we do not subject appearances to ultimate analysis. We simply accept things as they conventionally appear, without subjecting them to further scrutiny. This is what is meant by conventional designation. In everyday life, people commonly say things like, "Oh, the sprout arises from its own kind." This is a familiar way of speaking. For example, barley is produced from a cause of its own essence, and rice is produced from a cause of its own essence. They are all self-arising. But actually, as we mentioned earlier, it is entirely impossible for true self-arising to exist in the ultimate sense. Therefore, when studying the middle way, we must know what the two truths are. Of course, some of you already have a foundation in the middle way, so I won't say more about that. But for those without this foundation, you must first understand the difference between ultimate truth and conventional truth. Ultimate truth refers to what we discover through extremely subtle and precise analysis, namely that through this kind of analysis, we find that not a single phenomenon can be found to truly exist. That is what we call ultimate truth. Conventional truth is something different. In our everyday language and the flow of our ordinary conceptual thinking, we do not subject appearances to that kind of fine scrutiny. We simply take things at face value. Within that unexamined conventional world, even though these appearances are ultimately false, people establish all kinds of phenomena, and those phenomena established in this way are what we call conventionally established phenomena. So when studying the middle way, we must first understand what ultimate truth and conventional truth are. Of course, there are many ways to explain ultimate and conventional truths. For instance, the second and third turnings of the Dharma wheel have slightly different explanations of the two truths. But if you have studied root stanzas of the middle way or the adornment of the middle way, you basically know this concept. So what we're saying today is this: self-arising cannot be established on either the ultimate or the conventional level. And as we will see later, arising from other is also not established in the two truths. If self-arising is established in neither the ultimate nor the conventional truth, then in this world there is simply no way for self-arising to exist. So here it says, self-arising is not established even in terms of conventional designation. So why can't self-arising be established conventionally? We already said that arising as one and the same entity is unestablished ultimately, but shouldn't it be established conventionally? Actually, just as I mentioned earlier, in real life, when we say a preceding cause produces a subsequent result, like this sprout arises from the seed itself, or the cause produces an effect that shares the same essential nature as itself, that is what self-arising means. Many people think this way, but this statement is incorrect. Since the effect is seen after the cause ceases, even the worldly people don't accept them to be the same. This means that in the conventional world, whenever there is arising, the cause must definitely cease, meaning the seed part must perish. If the preceding seed doesn't cease, how could the result arise? It simply cannot arise. Thus, only when the cause has completely ceased can the effect be seen. In this way, even the conventional world does not accept self-arising. Whether it's an ordinary farmer, a young child, or a laborer, no matter who you ask, between the cause and effect does the cause cease? They will certainly say, only after the seed ceases can the effect arise. Otherwise, if the seed remains completely intact, how can it produce a result? So generally speaking, in this world, even a farmer with no academic background, if you ask him, is there self-arising? He would never say the seed and the sprout arise from themselves, possessing inherent nature. Everyone must understand that self-arising in this text refers specifically to arising that has an inherent nature. The same applies to arising from other, which we will cover later. So, just on a conventional level is there self-arising, but what is said conventionally isn't necessarily correct either. Therefore, there is no truly inherent self-arising in either the ultimate or the conventional truth. Well, earlier some people were spraying medical alcohol everywhere, which made me catch a cold. I didn't have a cold to begin with. Well, guess I do now. And so here it means that even in the conventional truth, we do not accept the seed in the causal phase and the sprout in the resultant phase as being one entity. In other words, we don't accept that cause and result are a self-arising of one and the same entity. Thus, if self-arising is not accepted ultimately, nor is it accepted conventionally, then in this world there is simply no reason to establish self-arising. Therefore, self-arising is completely unestablished. Next, we will cover the summary of the two truths, meaning the summary of the ultimate truth and the conventional truth. Therefore, the assertion that phenomena are self-arising is unreasonable in both ultimate reality and conventional appearances. So through our analysis above, if you use imputed conceptual thoughts to claim there is self-arising, that is impossible to establish. If you believe that whether inner or outer phenomena, any phenomena at all is self-arising, or that a seed produces an effect of its own nature, then whether in the ultimate truth, which is subject to genuine analysis, or in the conventional truth, which is free from such analysis, this view is utterly untenable. In both the ultimate truth and the conventional truth, self-arising is unreasonable. So in the Madhyamaka tradition of Nāgārjuna, it is also constantly maintained that self-arising is unreasonable. We will briefly discuss Nāgārjuna's reasoning for refuting self-arising below, though it won't be very extensive. What we mainly need to know here is that in reality, many people operate on the common sense principle: you reap what you sow. Plant melon seeds and you get melons, plant beans and you get beans. This kind of thinking is universally accepted. But does this mean accepting self-arising? As a conventional expression, one might say so. Conventionally, it is indeed imputed that melons produce melons and beans produce beans. There is such a conventional designation. But in reality, this is just a way people talk, a mere expression. If you truly examine the continuum, you will understand that something cannot arise from itself. Therefore, there is no such thing as inherently existent arising, even on the conventional level. Regarding this point, there is a slight difference between the views of the Prasangika and Svatantrika Madhyamaka schools, just a subtle difference. For example, the Svatantrika Madhyamaka school maintains that ultimately self-arising does not exist, but conventionally things arise in a dreamlike or illusion-like manner. In this way, the Svatantrika school qualifies its position by adding the term ultimately. But the Prasangika Madhyamaka school takes a different approach. As we will discuss later, when we examine phenomena with ultimate reasoning, the Prasangika argues self-arising cannot be found, not even on the conventional level. And if there is no self-arising even conventionally, how could there possibly be self-arising ultimately? This is why the Prasangika school does not need to draw a sharp line between the ultimate and the conventional. Instead, it simply asks, does any phenomenon truly arise from itself? If the answer is no, and it is no, then there is no need to go on and say, well, arising is absent ultimately, but it exists conventionally. Think about it this way. As for this so-called conventional arising, has it already been examined or not? If upon examination it turns out to be absent even under conventional scrutiny, then there is even less reason to speak of arising on the ultimate level. Thus, to summarize the key difference, masters of the Svatantrika school insist on adding qualifiers when stating that self-arising does not exist, words like ultimately or inherently or in the ultimate sense. From the Prasangika standpoint, however, those qualifiers are actually unnecessary. The negation is total and does not require that kind of hedging. When we studied Beacon of Certainty, we discussed some of these differences in this regard. Therefore, according to Candrakirti's view, no matter what phenomenon we examine, when we look at it with wisdom, it is truly beyond finding. It simply cannot be located. And this insight, this experience of finding nothing, is something each and every one of us is capable of arriving at. Some people ask me, you have been teaching the Dharma for nearly 40 years. Are there any enlightened individuals among your students? I think there are quite a number who have awakened. What kind of awakening is this? Through our analysis, if we truly know that all phenomena lack self-arising and arising from other, then at that moment, this is actually the greatest awakening. I believe that among my students, including the Khenpos and Khenmos who have listened to teachings here, or ordinary students, they all fully understand the truth that all phenomena lack inherent nature. Well then, this is actually a kind of awakening. We can call this a kind of awakening, because although it may not reach the height spoken of in the Great Perfection teachings, we can certainly say this is also a genuine awakening. So when listening to these classes, I hope everyone takes them seriously. Moreover, in the future, if you study completely on your own, you might not be able to follow through from beginning to end. Studying alone often brings more obstacles. Sometimes afflictions arise, sometimes you watch your computer or surf the internet, sometimes you just hang out with friends. So it is excellent if 3 or 4 or more people consciously study together. Why in the Buddha's teachings is the Sangha, the community of practitioners, considered so essential? It is because members of the Sangha can encourage and support one another and cultivate a healthy sense of moral self-reflection. You might think, everyone else is studying, so why aren't I? In this way, when several people study together, it's not easy to fall behind. So I see that many people are currently persisting in their studies. Some are studying the words of my perfect teacher, some the way of the Bodhisattva, and some the Diamond Sutra, and others root stanzas of the middle way or pramana. Nowadays, many people are organizing study groups on their own to learn together. For example, forming groups of 2 or 3 to learn. Actually, this method is very good. I also recently learned that many people have their own small circles of friends to study with. And of course, studying together like this freely and informally, there is nothing problematic about it. In fact, it makes it much easier to cover a great deal of ground in a short time. For example, you can make a 5-year or 10-year plan, deciding which treatises you intend to study within 3 years. This way it doesn't interfere with your work. You don't necessarily have to become a monastic, and you don't have to go to a monastery, yet we still elevate ourselves through this kind of learning. Actually, when I am teaching, I also pray for the blessings of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, so that anyone who hears these teachings, including those who listen through our audio and video recordings, may receive their blessings and attain all the blessings, merit, and benefits within. Because if we had to physically travel to a monastery to listen to the Dharma, wouldn't that be quite difficult? It is better for a few Dharma friends to study together on our own. We can complete this treatise now, and as we aim to finish this text, this method of study is highly practical for the future. So my approach now is also somewhat different from before. The way I used to teach the Dharma at the Academy has now been slightly adjusted. In the past, we would have so many people attending in person, But now I have also requested adjustments in our methods and have embraced a new approach. This makes it more convenient for oneself while still bringing benefit to others. So as we discussed earlier, self-arising truly does not exist. This is the conclusion reached by analyzing through the views of Candrakirti and Master Buddha Palita. Next, we will negate self-arising based on the reasoning of Nāgārjuna. This treatise states it as follows. If self-arising is asserted, the producer and the produced, the agent and the action would all be one. Since they are clearly not one, do not accept self-arising, for doing so incurs the many faults that have been explained at length. As we already mentioned, according to the views of Master Candrakirti and Master Buddha Palita, self-arising is indeed unestablished, and according to Nāgārjuna's root stanzas of the middle way, if we analyze relying on his reasoning, self-arising is actually unestablished as well. In fact, in Nāgārjuna's 6 treatises on the middle way, there is more content refuting arising from other, while the refutation of self-arising is relatively brief. Furthermore, regarding the refutation of self-arising, it is primarily in the Madhyamaka treatises of Master Shantarakshita that we find extensive refutations. Master Dharmakirti also provides some refutations of self-arising in his works on pramana. Therefore, believing that self-arising exists is fundamentally untenable. So, according to the view presented here, how is it refuted? If someone believes that true self-arising exists, that is, that things literally produce themselves, then the producer and the produced would have to be one and the same entity. After all, in self-arising, the thing generates itself. It is simultaneously the one doing the producing and the one being produced. Now think about the normal relationship between producer and produced. It is like the relationship between a father and his son. They are clearly two different people, two distinct beings. But if you assert self-arising, that distinction collapses. Father and son become one and the same. That is precisely the fault this argument exposes. Moreover, the action and the agent would also become one. For instance, when we usually use fire to burn wood, I am the agent, the wood is what is burned, and the fire does the burning. Or when a potter makes a vase or pottery, the potter is the agent and the pottery is the product. In this world, another example is that I am the speaker of the Dharma, so the speaker and the Dharma being spoken and those receiving the teaching all demonstrate the many subject-object relationships in the world, such as agent and action, producer and produced, or fire and fuel. In short, in the world there is the agent and the result they produce. But if you say cause and result are self-arising, that means the producer and the produced also become one entity. If producer and produced become one, then the seed and the sprout become one. If agent and action become one, then the potter and the pottery become one. If that were the case, the ordinary conventions of the world would collapse into confusion. Asserting self-arising leads to these and other similar faults. That is why it says, the action and the agent would all be one. Since they are not one, do not accept self-arising. Because these actions and agents are not one, these phenomena are not one entity. Therefore, even on the level of conventional designation, do not accept self-arising. We should not accept self-arising as inherently existent, as the root stanzas of the middle way repeatedly points out, that cause and result are one is never reasonable. Thus, cause and result cannot be one entity. It also says, if the fire is the fuel, the action and the agent would be one. If the fire and the fuel were the same, then the agent and the action would become one entity. These are the faults. Root stanzas of the middle way mentions many times that agent and action cannot be one entity. If they were one entity, all the laws of cause and result in the conventional world would fall into chaos. There are so many faults of this kind. Therefore, according to Nāgārjuna's view, the conventional establishment of cause and result can never be accepted as self-arising. If it were self-arising, then the cause and result would become one entity. Once cause and result become one entity, then, for example, yesterday's seed and today's sprout would actually become one entity as well. Why do we say today's seed and tomorrow's sprout would also become one entity? Because of the assertion that cause and result are one. Consequently, the relationships between these causes and effects in our world would simply fall into chaos. Therefore, this assertion is fundamentally untenable. Hearing this, some people might think, if self-arising is unreasonable, wouldn't the cause and result we directly observe all fall into chaos? Actually, within the illusory conventional truth, people's establishment of the cause and result of phenomena also has distinctions between what is reasonable and unreasonable. But in the presence of Madhyamaka masters, all these establishments will be completely negated. How are they negated? In the relevant Madhyamaka commentaries, including those by Master Tsongkhapa and Venerable Rendawa, their Madhyamaka treatises state, by negating the four extremes of arising within the ultimate truth of all phenomena, after the four extremes are negated, one accepts the existence of arising through dependent origination. But later masters of the Sakya school and other great teachers also challenged the assertion that dependent arising could be established through ultimate analysis. They argued that if the four extremes of arising do not exist, is there any need to examine arising through dependent origination? If it could be established upon examination, it could be refuted using the same reasoning applied to self-arising and arising from other. Therefore, dependent arising cannot be established through ultimate analysis either. Of course, regarding arising through dependent origination, some great masters of the Nyingma school also acknowledge that there can be such a thing as arising through dependent origination. However, this kind of arising is merely a conventionally designated illusion-like arising. It is not something established through true logical analysis. We can accept this dreamlike, illusion-like dependent arising on the conventional level. But while accepting it, we must also understand that it lacks true inherent nature, and when examined with ultimate reasoning, it is non-arising. Some people might think one moment you say there is arising and the next you say there is no arising, so is there arising or not? Actually, in the conventional truth, there is no inherently existent arising, since in this world we simply cannot find any truly inherent arising. Self-arising is therefore unreasonable. This is the result of our logical analysis. In reality, regarding self-arising, arising from other, arising from both, and arising without cause, when truly examined with ultimate reasoning, all four extremes of arising are unestablished. Then, according to the power of cause and result and dependent origination in the world, is there any arising at all? We can accept that there is the arising of false appearances, but this kind of arising cannot withstand any analysis. In that case, would the ordinary distinctions between cause and non-cause collapse into confusion? Not at all, because although within the false appearances of conventional designation, the conventional laws of dependent origination involve the relationship of producer and produced, these are not confused. Yet when truly analyzed, not a single phenomenon can withstand ultimate analysis, but when left unanalyzed, there are still slight distinctions in the conventional truth. For example, a few days ago I was talking about our brain. Nowadays, many scientists believe that consciousness arises from the brain. In reality, this claim cannot even be established by the logic of pramana. What is the main reason it cannot be established? Actually, we have many logical arguments regarding this. For instance, there is a cognitive scientist named Donald Hoffman, a professor at the University of California. In one of his books, he mentions that, for example, the rich taste of tea we drink, the sound of our own yawns or sneezes, or the sensation of pressure when leaning against a desk. Regarding all these various sensations, up to now, scientists still lack a widely accepted explanation for how subjective experience arises. Their scientific journals have published many analyses of this kind. They also believe that although our brain does all sorts of things during these processes, how exactly does consciousness arise within the brain? This secret up to now remains unresolved. So they think the brain is like a magician. Suddenly this magician appears, conjuring up one thing after another. However, as for the true secret of the magic, the magician will certainly never tell you. In the same way, the brain is like an exceptionally clever magician, relying on the relationship between the brain and consciousness. Although various magic-like phenomena are conjured up, many scientists still maintain that conscious experience arises from the brain. As to how these conscious states arise, or what their function is, they have not yet provided a definitive explanation for mysteries like these. Only in their journals and in their related literature are there many analyses regarding various brain activities. But in reality, how is consciousness truly produced from the brain? They simply do not know. Even some physicists have said the same thing. So to many of the Dharma friends listening today, what do I want to say? Although in the conventional truth the distinction between cause and non-cause certainly exists. From the Madhyamaka perspective, however, none of these distinctions can be ultimately established. cause and non-cause are equally unestablished, all such distinctions are refuted under ultimate analysis. But in the real life of conventional designation, our consciousness can give rise to consciousness. This is supported by numerous Buddhist teachings and lines of reasoning. In conventional cyclic existence, the continuum of consciousness continuously arises. For example, the continuum of consciousness in one life may take rebirth as a hungry ghost, in another as an animal, and later as a human being. In this way, the consciousness wandering in samsara continuously extends its continuum. Such a consciousness does exist, but right now scientists believe that consciousness arises from the brain. Yet to date this claim remains unproven. Regarding some scientific research on this topic, we can introduce more to you in the future. Even though this is knowledge within the realm of conventional designation, yet conventionally many of us might have received this kind of education, assuming that every scientific explanation is beyond question, thinking, our consciousness must arise from the brain. But just as we discussed earlier, today any scientist, through various theories or through various reasoning and data, might study a particular region of our brain, including its various components, attempting to understand how consciousness arises. This is a topic that countless scientists have been investigating. In fact, in the scientific community, their most hotly debated topic is exactly how consciousness arises. But up to now, no scientific experiment has yet identified where in the brain consciousness originates, for instance, which region of the brain produces it. Because when observing scientifically, inside the brain there are countless densely packed cells distributed across many different regions. But among these, is it the brain as a whole that gives rise to consciousness, or is consciousness triggered only by a specific area? For example, this region is related to visual consciousness, and that region is related to auditory consciousness. But from exactly which place does consciousness arise? As of now, research in this area has reached no definitive conclusion. So sometimes assuming that every scientific explanation is beyond question is not entirely reasonable. Of course, in this treatise, whether it is a cause or a non-cause, they are all negated. I see many people are studying the root stanzas of the middle way. At this point, according to Nāgārjuna's view, examining whether the agent of the action and the action itself are one entity or distinct entities, and using this reasoning from the root stanzas to refute self-arising is quite easy and much simpler. However, when establishing the conventional truth, it is not always necessary to use the detailed analysis found in the root stanzas of the middle way. In particular, Pramana also explains how the arising of cause and result is established within conventional designation. We will discuss this principle more later on. So, the refutation of self-arising is now complete. Phenomena do not arise from themselves. I wonder if everyone has understood this. Next, we will refute arising from other. This section is divided into a general refutation of the assertion of arising from other and a specific refutation of the mind-only school. As for the mind-only school, there is quite a lot of text refuting them later on, so they are included here under the refutation of arising from other. Then the general refutation is divided into two parts. First, a general refutation of the assertion that arising from other exists in the ultimate truth, and second, a specific refutation of the assertion that inherently existent arising exists in the conventional truth. From this we can see that there is no arising from other in the ultimate truth, nor is there arising from other in the conventional truth. The first part, the general refutation of the assertion that arising from other exists in the ultimate truth, is divided into three aspects. First, the actual refutation of arising from other. Second, dispelling contradictions with worldly conventions. And third, explaining the merit of this refutation. Among these, the actual refutation of arising from other is further divided into a general refutation of arising from other, a specific refutation of arising from other, and refuting by analyzing the result through the four extremes. It is divided into these three aspects. The first is the general refutation of arising from other, which is divided into refuting by showing absurd consequences and refuting the opponent's defensive replies. This means that when the opponent offers a defense, our school refutes it as well. Now we will first discuss refuting by showing absurd consequences. Here at the very beginning, Candrakirti opens by throwing out a pointed question to the opponent. If you assert that phenomena arise from other, this leads to an absurd consequence. At the very beginning, before formally entering the refutation, Master Chandrakirti's opening statement immediately sets the tone for the debate. So this is how he begins. We need to know what the opponent's main views are regarding arising from other. Actually, the realist schools within Buddhism, including the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika schools, also believe that arising from other is reasonable. The Vaibhashika and Sautrantika schools hold this view. Why do they think so? Because the Buddha also taught the 6 causes and the 4 conditions in the sutras. That is, the 6 causes and 4 conditions. These have all been taught. In the root stanzas of the Middle Way, it has also mentioned the 4 conditions: the causal condition, the object condition, the dominant condition, and the immediate condition. So the realist schools assert it this way: when a phenomenon is produced relying on external conditions, this is arising from other. As everyone knows, among the 4 conditions, when the eye perceives an external object, the external object serves as the object condition for the arising of visual consciousness. When I want to see something, the seed of visual consciousness in the alaya consciousness serves as the causal condition. What is the dominant condition? My eye faculty, along with various phenomena that do not obstruct the field of vision, are called the dominant condition. What is the immediate condition? When the previous moment of visual consciousness ceases and the next moment immediately arises, this is called the immediate condition. Therefore, just to see an external object, the visual consciousness needs to rely on these 4 conditions. By the same logic, when a seed produces a sprout, it also requires the presence of various causes and conditions. For example, the seed acts as the causal condition, along with various dominant conditions. However, since a sprout is physical matter, it does not involve object condition or immediately preceding condition in the way mental events do. These principles are mentioned in the treasury of Abhidharma and also in the commentaries on the root stanzas of the Middle Way, but some parts of the commentaries might be slightly difficult to understand. Master Chandrakirti's auto-commentary also touches upon this. You can read it yourselves. So the point here is that the opponent believes all phenomena arise depending on the 4 conditions or the 6 causes and conditions, the 6 causes and 4 conditions. All phenomena arise depending on these 6 causes and 4 conditions. Since they are produced depending on the 6 causes and 4 conditions, none of these phenomena are produced from their own entities. Therefore, self-arising is unreasonable, but arising from other must be reasonable, because if something is to arise, it can arise depending on so many causes and conditions. In that case, in real life, arising from other should be established. This is what the opponent believes. Then Master Chandrakirti begins to refute them. If something arises from something other, then darkness could arise from a flame. And in that case, everything could arise from everything, because all non-causes are equally other in relation to the result. This is the most important reasoning for refuting arising from other. Regarding this reasoning, I see some of our Dharma friends seeming to have a vague understanding on the surface, but they haven't yet grasped the true crux of this logic. They haven't figured it out. If you don't fully understand it, you might mistakenly think this Madhyamaka reasoning doesn't seem that sharp. But actually it is because their mastery of Madhyamaka logic is not profound enough, and their understanding of the reasoning is not clear enough. Therefore, we must clearly understand the true meaning of the original text. This is very important. If arising depending on another phenomenon, for example, arising depending on external causes and conditions, is called arising from other, then the other in their assertion of arising from other would be the exact same concept as the self in self-arising. Conventionally, when we talk about me and him or father and son, these are conventionally imputed as distinct entities, but not truly and inherently distinct entities. This treatise does not refute them. What is being refuted here is inherently existent arising from other. Only 2 truly independent things with inherent nature could be called a relationship of truly distinct entities. Grasping this point is crucial for the subsequent refutations. Otherwise, regarding the relationship between the seed and the sprout, we would never be able to refute it. If we know that different entity here refers to a truly existent distinct entity, then this other entity and that other entity are 2 phenomena that possess true inherent nature. Therefore, the different entity discussed here is not the different entity referred to conventionally. The relationship of distinct entities in the conventional truth, such as between a seed and a sprout, can be accepted as conventionally designated distinct entities. Even though the two cannot coexist at the same time, we can still say the seed and the sprout are distinct entities relative to each other. Because for the sprout, the seed is the cause that produces it. We can also say it like this. For instance, the seed of the sprout is the cause that produces it. However, truly inherently existent distinct entities are never established at any time, because the moment the sprout arises, the seed ceases immediately. The two cannot coexist. So the analysis here is very rigorous. If the opponent claims that another phenomenon is produced depending on another phenomenon, there would be a tremendous fault. Asserting that another phenomenon arises from another phenomenon leads to an extremely absurd consequence. What is that absurd consequence? In that case, thick darkness should arise from a flame. Originally, when a flame arises, it does not produce darkness. Darkness should disappear, right? When a flame appears, darkness cannot possibly arise. It is destroyed. The moment a flame appears, darkness immediately vanishes without a trace. But according to your view, because you assert they are distinct entities, if a different entity could produce another, then the flame would not be the cause that destroys darkness. Instead, it should become the cause that produces darkness. What is the reason? It is because they are distinct entities, because they are inherently existent, distinct entities. If we accepted arising from other, cause and result would descend into chaos. Originally, the result arises depending on this cause, but if you assert it this way, then darkness would also arise from a flame, and the flame could no longer be the cause that destroys darkness. If darkness could arise from a flame, then darkness should also arise from the sun, darkness should also arise from the moon, and darkness should also arise from a lamp. This is completely unreasonable. If that were the case, everything could arise from everything. If you accept this view, it would mean that from all phenomena, whether causes or non-causes, all results could equally arise. So what is a genuine cause? Usually, only a seed can produce a sprout. For example, barley arises from a barley seed, and potatoes arise from potatoes. These are genuine causes. Then what is a non-cause? For instance, if potatoes could arise from stones, or flames could arise from a computer, and so on. Once arising from other is accepted, the distinction between cause and non-cause collapses into confusion. Since all non-producers are equally other, because these non-causes, which cannot produce the result, are actually also inherently distinct entities from the result, since their nature as other is the same, then non-causes should also be able to produce the result. If cause and result are different, then a cause is the same as a non-cause. Just as Nāgārjuna repeatedly points out in the root stanzas of the Middle Way, if you assert that cause and result are distinct entities, then there is absolutely no difference between a cause and a non-cause. The logic of same entity and different entity here is extremely crucial. In real life, many people might not quite understand this kind of reasoning. If you don't grasp this line of reasoning, you might not feel particularly impacted, and might even wonder, even if cause and result are distinct entities, how could darkness arise from a flame? Then how could a sprout arise from a stone? How is that possible? Actually, the key here is that the opponent asserts cause and result are inherently distinct entities. So since you claim cause and result are two inherently distinct entities, and that another phenomenon can be produced from an inherently different entity, then a cause should be able to produce any result. For example, a barley seed usually produces barley, but now it should also produce rice. Why? Because they are all equally other. If a cause that is other can produce the result, then a cause and a non-cause would be exactly the same without any difference. To avoid this fault, the opponent immediately tries to salvage their view, saying, although the barley sprout is a different entity from both the barley seed and the rice seed, the barley seed can produce the barley sprout, while the rice seed cannot. Therefore, there is a big difference between different others. Regarding this, we might also think this way in daily life. Although they are equally distinct entities, among these distinct entities, some possess the conditions to produce each other, while others lack the conditions to produce each other. For instance, don't people today talk about genes? If the genetics match, a causal relationship is acknowledged. If the genetics differ, the relationship of producer and produced is not acknowledged, so a cause and a non-cause are completely different. The opponent attempts this kind of defense. Next is the second section of the outline, refuting the opponent's defensive replies. This section is divided into two parts. First, explaining away the fault. Second, refuting this reply. It is divided into these two aspects. First, let's discuss explaining away the fault. The opponent argues as follows: only that produced by another is called the result. Though it is other, what produces it is the cause. Arising occurs within the same continuum. A rice sprout does not arise from a barley seed, and so on. Regarding the absurd consequences we pointed out, the opponent begins to correct us, saying, although we accept that cause and result are distinct entities, even so, the faults you mentioned, such as everything arises from everything, or darkness arises from a flame, do not apply to our view. Why wouldn't they apply? Because the other we assert is a specific kind of other, one that can genuinely form a causal relationship. For example, a father begets a son, but the son is not produced by a non-father. A sprout is produced from its own seed, but a sprout cannot possibly be produced from a non-seed of that sprout. Therefore, this is completely different from the analogy of a flame producing darkness. Actually, why are they distinct entities here? Regarding the detailed analysis of why they are distinct entities, I don't have time to explain it extensively this time. If you have some time, you can study the root stanzas of the middle way. Also, in the earlier sections of Prasanapada, there are specific refutations of this. In the Vigrahavyavartani, there is also detailed reasoning. Actually, defining and analyzing different entity is one of the more difficult topics in Madhyamaka. When our school refutes arising from other, we use various Madhyamaka reasonings, such as the fallacy of the proof being just as unestablished as the thesis, to counterattack in the Madhyamaka way, refuting the opponent's argument that cause and result are distinct entities. In other words, both the thesis they try to prove and the reason used to prove it fall into the same fault. Being identical in nature, we use the opponent's own position against them. We borrow the opponent's own assertion to refute them. Here, because the opponent themselves asserts they are distinct entities, since they are distinct entities, we ask in return, is the other you speak of an other with true inherent characteristics, or is it an other without inherent characteristics? If you say it is an other with inherent characteristics, then how exactly is that established? Upon hearing this, the opponent is immediately left speechless, unable to counterattack. So, by applying the reasoning found in the Vigrahavyavartani, one of the 6 treatises of Madhyamaka, we can easily refute the opponent's view that cause and result are inherently distinct entities. If you have time, you can take a look at the Vigrahavyavartani. By doing so, you will understand, we truly cannot accept cause and result as truly distinct entities. For if we accept them as distinct entities, then we would have to accept that darkness could arise from a flame. Actually, in ordinary daily life, darkness arising from a flame is simply impossible. But by continuously applying the sharp reasoning of Madhyamaka, we leave the opponents with no way out until they finally have to accept this logic. Therefore, sometimes we still need to study these slightly deeper and somewhat more difficult Dharma teachings. This is very important. Especially for those with some foundation in the Dharma, you should embrace the challenge when studying. But if someone truly has no foundation and simply cannot engage their mind at all, then there is not much we can do. Their mind has, so to speak, gone into standby mode. So in that case, we just have to let it be. However, just listening to it is still beneficial. At the very least, what can it plant? It can plant a seed of prajna in your continuum. Take Master Sthiramati as an example. In a previous life, he was reborn as a pigeon. By hearing Master Vasubandhu recite the Prajna Paramita Sutras, he planted roots of virtue, and in his very next life he was reborn as Master Sthiramati, endowed with great wisdom. So just planting a seed of prajna for ourselves is also very good, but most importantly, when studying, we must learn to analyze logically on our own. And when observing, we shouldn't just blindly follow the train of thought given in the commentaries, we need to investigate it ourselves. For instance, we can frequently reflect, if all phenomena lack inherent nature, then is there really self-arising or arising from other? What exactly does this self-arising mean? Do I personally believe that phenomena are self-arising, or do I believe in arising from other? We should analyze in this way. Today's school education generally follows a fixed mold. Whatever the teacher says, the students merely repeat it. And if they can repeat it perfectly, the teacher will say, "Ah, you are excellent. You are speaking exactly according to my thoughts." In the West, the educational model is certainly not like this. Western education emphasizes cultivating critical thinking and developing one's own creative thinking. This is actually very important. With good analytical skills, then irreversible conviction can arise in one's own mind stream. So, what is the opponent saying here? The opponent believes that all causes and results in the world are distinct entities, but there are two types of relationships between distinct entities. One type is a relation between distinct entities where one cannot produce the other, such as a flame not producing darkness. The other is a relation between distinct entities where one can produce the other, such as a seed producing a sprout. Well, this kind of arising from other requires four conditions. The opponent argues here that the arising from other, they assert, must satisfy four conditions, so it would not incur the fault of everything arising from everything. They reply as follows: only that produced by another is called the result. Though it is a distinct entity, what produces it is the cause. Arising occurs within the same continuum. A rice sprout does not arise from a barley seed, and so on. The opponent says here, there is a reason why we assert that a cause and result that are distinct entities can produce one another. What is the reason? Asserting arising from other between cause and result requires meeting these conditions. The first condition is only that produced by another is called the result. Any phenomenon produced by the action of another phenomenon is definitely called a result. This is defining the cause from the side of the result. Here, the cause is defined in reverse. From the perspective of the result, it means that this cause must be able to produce its result to be considered a cause. For instance, this seed can produce its result, only then is this seed worthy of being called a cause. This is the first definition. The opponent says, we don't just randomly accept anything as a cause. It must have the capacity to produce a result to be acknowledged as a cause. So this is the first condition. The second condition is, though it is a distinct entity, what produces it is the cause. Even though it is a distinct entity, the most crucial point is that it has the capacity to produce. This is the definition of a cause. First, the cause can produce the result. Second, the result is produced relying on a cause that is a distinct entity. So this relationship exists between cause and result. Here the opponent defines the cause from two aspects. The third condition is within the same continuum. Although they assert that cause and result are distinct entities, these two belong to the same continuum. For example, the me of yesterday and the me of today are one continuum, and the sprout and the seed belong to the same or the same kind of continuum. This is the third condition. The fourth condition is that the producer must actually produce the result. Actually, the cause can produce the subsequent result. We speak of preceding cause and subsequent result, where the cause comes first and the result follows. The preceding moments produce the subsequent results. The opponent states here, only when these four conditions are met is it considered the arising from other that we assert. Therefore, a rice sprout does not arise from a barley seed, and so on. A rice sprout is not produced from a cause that is not its own, that is, from a barley seed. Thus, the opponent clearly states here, although the cause and result we assert are distinct entities, they belong to the same continuum. So even though they are distinct entities, these distinct entities have specific conditions. Just like the genes mentioned earlier regarding genetics, if one's genes match their parents, we can say it is produced within the same kind, the same continuum. Actually, before studying this treatise, we also thought this way. Our thinking was probably fundamentally the same as the opponents. Yes, this is exactly how cause and result work. A seed can be the cause of a sprout, and a sprout can be the result of a seed. They are of the same kind within the same continuum. When the condition of preceding and subsequent phenomena having a true functional relationship is met, then we can accept that the cause produces the result. Looking at it this way, we might feel, wow, the opponent's answer is very powerful. It's true, the so-called cause and result as distinct entities should be reasonable. If we had not seen the subsequent analytical refutations below, we might also think, oh yes, your answer is correct. This is exactly how worldly causal relationships are. People all over the world also believe that cause and result should be separate, distinct entities. Ordinary people in the world would probably say the same. Even though we haven't asked worldly people what they think, they likely hold this view as well. So looking at it this way, the opponent's view seems to be correct. But the sharp reasoning of Madhyamaka points out that asserting distinct entities is unreasonable. Now we will begin to refute the opponent's earlier defensive reply. So how does our school respond? Just as Kimshuka, barley, and lotus do not produce a rice sprout because they lack the power, are not one continuum, and are not of the same kind, so too a rice seed does not truly produce a rice sprout because it is also other. Now every stanza here brings back memories from more than 30 years ago. I haven't taught this treatise much in between. At that time the assembly hall of the academy was quite dilapidated. This stanza was taught at that time by Khenpo Namdrol, who had come from India. What did he bring us? At that time His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche said, "You have been outside, so your knowledge and experience in various aspects should be quite good. You should teach entering the middle way to the Khenpos here at our academy." So the first time he came to the academy, he taught entering the middle way. We would ask questions in the middle of it, engaging in various discussions on the Dharma meanings. Recalling those scenes makes it feel like it was just yesterday.
At
that time Khenpo Namdrol taught using the Lhasa dialect. At first we couldn't really understand because his Lhasa accent was quite heavy. Even though he was speaking Tibetan, we still didn't quite understand. Later, after 1990, I began leading Han Dharma friends in studying the Buddha's teachings, and gradually I set aside teaching in Tibetan. But the seeds of studying this treatise back then seemed to remain in my mind. Now, as I read each sentence, its meaning naturally comes back to my mind. Next, our school begins to refute the opponent's view. What kind of view? For example, plants like the Kimshuka, barley, and lotus. One is the Kimshuka, which is a type of plant. Then there is barley. But the barley here in our Tibetan text is ne, nuz, and ne means highland barley. However, Master Fazun translated it as barley. Generally speaking, agriculture in Tibetan areas mainly involves growing highland barley, so the difference between barley and highland barley is quite significant. The tsampa we eat is highland barley flour, but ordinary barley, whatever variety it may be, is not called tsampa. But the Tibetan word here is ne. Perhaps Master Chandra Kirti also said barley, but the translator at the time translated it as ne. Because ne means highland barley. Later, when Master Fazun was translating, he might have felt that if he translated it as highland barley, people in Han regions wouldn't understand, so he intentionally translated it as barley, since this grain exists in Han regions. Perhaps that's why he translated it that way. But having eaten so much tsampa himself, how could he translate this highland barley as barley? Anyway, I didn't change it in my translation this time. We can look into this aspect later. I'm not sure how other translations handle it. Then it says here, for example, among plants there is the Kimshuka, which is also called the Ashoka flower. There is also barley, as well as the lotus flower, its stamens and lotus seeds. These plants do not produce a rice sprout because they lack the capacity. Our school says, what you said is correct. These plants cannot produce a rice sprout because they lack the capacity to produce a rice sprout. First, they lack the capacity. They do not have the ability to produce the result. Second, they are not of the same continuum. They are not a single continuum because these plants are not of the same continuum as each other. For example, a barley seed and rice are not of the same continuum. Third, they are not of the same kind. These plants and rice are not of the same kind. So it speaks from three aspects here: lacking the capacity, not being of the same continuum, and not being of the same kind. Actually, being of the same kind and being of the same continuum are basically the same. However, there is still a distinction between continuum and kind. For example, regarding kind, one highland barley grain and another are of the same kind. Then regarding continuum, each individual highland barley grain has its own independent continuum. So although they are of the same kind, they are not the same continuum. For instance, the rice in this paddy field and the rice in that paddy field belong to the same kind, but all these rice plants are not one continuum. If they were the same continuum, then a single rice seed should be able to grow into all the rice in the whole world, or take us human beings, for example. All people in the world belong to the category of humanity, but let me see how the Tibetan expresses it. Yes, of the same kind, it's of the same kind and of the same continuum. Simply put, the scope of same kind is broader, and as for continuum, every phenomenon has its own independent continuum. So earlier we mentioned observing from these three aspects. What we just mentioned were the kimshuka, barley, lotus seeds, and so on. They have absolutely nothing to do with rice. Why? First, they lack the capacity to produce a rice sprout. Also, they are not in the same continuum as rice. Moreover, they are not of the same kind. So we can also understand that they are distinct from one another. We do accept this kind of conventional distinctness. If things are conventional distinct, we certainly accept that. Therefore, these plants definitely cannot produce a rice sprout. You see, how could rice be produced from barley? If it could, then there are plenty of paddy fields in Tibetan areas, but how could barley or highland barley be produced in a paddy field? So they are definitely not of the same kind, nor are they of the same continuum, so they don't have a relationship of producer and produced. This is very clear to us. But Master Chandrakirti's most crucial reasoning here is neither does the rice seed, because it is also other. The rice seed, the seed of the rice, also cannot produce the rice sprout. In other words, the sprout is not produced by the rice seed itself. Why? Because it is other, because you accept them as inherently distinct entities. If cause and result are inherently distinct entities, then when we examine this using Madhyamaka reasoning, there is in fact no genuine relationship of producer and produced between the rice seed and the rice sprout. Why? Because what is it that you assert? You assert they are distinct entities, and moreover, inherently distinct entities. If you accept that cause and result are inherently distinct entities, that is definitely unreasonable. We will also discuss this below. Since they are inherently existent, distinct entities, then both phenomena would have to be independently established. If neither phenomenon is established, or if only one is established independently, they cannot be called distinct entities. Actually, in the world, according to the relationship between a seed and a sprout, the two cannot be distinct entities. Because before the seed has completely ceased, the sprout cannot possibly arise. Only after the seed has been destroyed can the sprout arise. Otherwise, there would be the fault of the cause and result existing simultaneously. If you accept that the sprout arises only after the seed has ceased, then one is a cause that has ceased in the past, and the other is a newly arisen result in the present. Are these two in a relationship of distinct entities? There is no relationship of distinct entities at all. For example, a barren woman's son does not exist at all. If I say the barren woman's son and I are distinct entities, that is sheer nonsense, because one exists while the other does not. Or, for instance, if I say space and I are distinct entities, but space has no inherent nature at all. For something that doesn't exist at all, if you say you and it are distinct entities, how can distinct entities be established when one has inherent nature and the other doesn't? Yet the opponent precisely asserts that there are two inherently existent distinct entities. But actually, what is the relationship between cause and result? When the cause is present, the result has not yet arisen. When the result arises, the cause has already completely ceased. Therefore, cause and result can never have a relationship of distinct entities. Later in this treatise, it will also use the examples of Maitreya and Upagupta to illustrate distinct entities that are not of the same continuum. This will be discussed later. This is a very crucial principle. Therefore, when Madhyamaka refutes arising from other here, it is impossible to refute it if we only use loose reasoning. The opponent's meaning here is, as Madhyamaka followers just gave a bunch of reasons, but the arising from other we assert concerns specific causal relations, such as the cause and result being of the same continuum and the same kind. To this our school replies, you can make all these defensive arguments, but the key is whether cause and result are distinct entities. If cause and result are distinct entities, then when the cause exists, the result does not exist, and when the result exists, the cause does not exist. Therefore, just like light and darkness, cause and result are not distinct entities, nor do they have the relationship of producer and produced. If you say that cause and result exist simultaneously, then the world will laugh at you, because if things were as you claim, farmers wouldn't even need to plant crops. Since they already have the cause, they wouldn't need to plant anything. If cause and result are not simultaneous, then following a sequence, the preceding cause must cease before the subsequent result can arise, or the preceding cause hasn't ceased while the subsequent result has already arisen. In that case, there is no need for the result to arise, because if the preceding cause is permanently and inherently existent, it would always exist. Therefore, no matter how many results there are, they could never be produced. This was also discussed earlier, so this kind of Madhyamaka reasoning seems quite interesting, doesn't it? Actually, the key point of the reasoning here is neither does the rice seed. Plants like the kimshuka, barley and lotus seeds cannot produce rice because they are not the causes of rice, and they are distinct entities from the rice. If one asserts that cause and result are inherently distinct entities, the cause definitely cannot produce the result. If all causes cannot produce results, then a rice seed cannot produce a rice sprout, a mother cannot produce a son, and among all genuine causes they cannot produce their own results either, because they are distinct entities. If they are distinct entities, the producer and the produced are entirely distinct entities. If this is the case, we can think about it. For example, a barley seed can produce barley, but a barley seed cannot produce rice or other phenomena because the barley seed and the rice are distinct entities. Or we can say barley can produce barley because it is produced from the same continuum and the same kind. Then why can't a barley seed produce rice? Because it lacks the capacity to produce another phenomenon unrelated to it. But now if you accept that cause and result are truly distinct entities, even though you think cause and result are of the same continuum, the same kind, and have a relationship of producer and produced, if you accept a truly inherently existent distinct entities, then this distinct entity becomes exactly like stones and wood. The cause and the non-cause would become identical, inevitably leading to the fault of everything arising from everything. I wonder if you have understood this. It seems some people might have understood it while some might not have. If you understand, then good. If you don't, there is not much we can do. Next is the specific refutation of arising from other, which is divided into two aspects. First, refuting arising from other when cause and result are sequential. The following refutations all belong to the specific refutation of arising from other. We discussed the general refutation earlier, which everyone knows. After the general refutation of arising from other comes the specific refutation. In this specific refutation, we must refute distinct entities when cause and result are sequential, and then refute distinct entities when cause and result are simultaneous. Cause and result are either sequential distinct entities or simultaneous distinct entities. If neither of these exists, then distinct entities do not exist. If you still do not understand this principle, once we finish explaining the specific refutation of arising from other, everyone will certainly understand it clearly. Now we will discuss why arising from other with sequential cause and result is unreasonable, which includes the actual refutation and refuting the defensive reply. It is divided into these two aspects. First is the actual refutation. Since the sprout and seed do not exist simultaneously, there is no other. How could the seed be other? The sprout arising from the seed is ultimately unestablished, so one should abandon the view of arising from other. Is this it? Yes? Yes, it goes like this. The following is the actual refutation. Because cause and result are certainly not simultaneous, we say it follows a sequence of preceding cause and subsequent result. But this is also unreasonable. Why is it unreasonable? For example, consider two people, one named Maitreya and the other named Upagupta. If two people live together, we can say they are distinct entities existing at the same time. You and I am here and you are here. These are two distinct entities with true inherent characteristics existing at the same time, but the sprout and the seed do not coexist at the same time. The seed must come first, and the sprout comes later. So the two cannot arise simultaneously. Since they are not simultaneous, the sprout and seed do not exist simultaneously. The sprout and the seed do not exist at the same time because when the seed exists, the sprout has not yet emerged. Right? It hasn't emerged. Some of us here are professional farmers, so they are quite clear about this. During the grey seed stage, the sprout certainly hasn't arisen yet. Everyone should know this. When we see the green sprout, where did the original seed go? Perhaps a little husk of the original seed remains, but it no longer has the capacity to produce a sprout because the seed was destroyed long ago. So no matter how we analyze it, when the seed is present, the sprout has not yet been produced, which is equivalent to a barren woman's son. and when the sprout is produced, the seed has already completely ceased. Therefore, in the same moment in time, it is absolutely impossible for the two to coexist. This mainly explains that the seed and the sprout are distinct entities, but asserting cause and result as distinct entities carries many faults. So at any given time, it is impossible for the two to exist simultaneously. They do not exist simultaneously. If they do not exist simultaneously, there is no other, there are no distinct entities, because when this is present, that is not, and when that is present, this is not. It is just like me and space, or me and a barren woman's son. Nowadays, perhaps through various medical procedures, a barren woman can be made to have a child, but such a person is not called a barren woman. A barren woman is a woman unable to bear children. That is what a barren woman means. Or a rabbit's horn. A rabbit's horn is also completely non-existent. A rabbit's horn means something that does not exist on a rabbit's head. That is why it is called a rabbit's horn. So these are phenomena that are completely impossible to exist. Just like flowers in the sky, though right now there's a peye sound. This is also a flower in the sky, isn't it? So many things are hard to say. For anything that is non-existent and something that is existent, it is impossible for these two to have a relationship of cause and result. Similarly, here we do not accept that cause and result are distinct entities. Since there is no other, if there are no distinct entities, how could the seed be other? Then why do you say there is a relationship of distinct entities between the seed and the sprout? Have you lost your mind? They don't even have their own entities. One is a phenomenon that hasn't formed at all if you think they are distinct entities. That is truly ridiculous. The sprout arising from the seed is ultimately unestablished. Therefore, because they are distinct entities, the claim that the sprout arises from the seed and this kind of argument can never be established. So, you should abandon this mistaken view. In the world we truly believe that arising from other exists. We will continue to refute this below. At such times we often feel a bit doubtful. When I first started studying Madhyamaka, I also thought, don't the things we clearly accept exist now? Are we slandering the conventional truth? But in reality, Madhyamaka examines all worldly phenomena from a very elevated perspective and refutes their true existence. This is to help us see through this life. Actually, it is not forcing us to forcefully think phenomena don't exist, they don't exist, they don't exist. It is not like that. It must use reasoning to genuinely convince us what Buddhism says is truly correct. It seems that entering the middle way is just a thin book, as if there's nothing much to it. But in reality, every one of its logical arguments is extremely sharp. When you truly try to understand its meaning, you will have no choice but to accept it. So if you truly accept inherent self-arising is also impossible to exist. This self-arising phenomenon cannot be found in anything. And if you now accept arising from other, then through the observation of Madhyamaka reasoning, arising from other is indeed unfindable as well. Most importantly, when refuting arising from other here, we examine whether there is a relationship between cause and result. If there is a truly inherent distinct entity, then this is not the relationship of producer and produced. Therefore, apart from this, arising from other also does not exist. That is why over the past few days we also quoted the teachings spoken by the Buddha in the Avatamsaka Sutra, the teachings on the non-arising of all phenomena. Actually, these are very important. The Buddha taught non-arising in many sutras, but regarding this non-arising we previously did not know it held such profound meaning. If someone has studied Madhyamaka and has a slight understanding of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, they will realize, we really are in a deluded world. Things are originally non-existent, but we take them as existent. We hold on to this kind of belief. Therefore, the treatise written by Gendun Chopel in the past, called The Adornment of Nāgārjuna's Intent, what does he mention in it? Including thoughts like, I just remembered something, or I want to cook, that's the general idea. Any thought of I want this or that, these are all grasping at true existence. Actually, what we just mentioned, the idea that the sprout arises from the seed, is also our ingrained grasping at true existence. Whether innate or acquired, these are all forms of grasping at true existence, which we ordinary people need to break. To break this grasping, we must use reasoning. Without reasoning from beginningless time until now in this life, we have always believed that this vase is truly existent, this computer is truly existent. Although we don't say it out loud and we might not specifically think about it in our minds, we always feel that arising exists, death exists, birth and death exist, and the seed produces the sprout is real. However, this perceived reality is unreliable and needs to be refuted, because we ordinary beings all think we are right. Like this, we have many concepts that need to be refuted. If they need to be refuted through the analytical methods of the no-self of persons and the no-self of phenomena, we will understand that many of the thoughts we generate are actually unreasonable. By doing this, we can cut off this grasping at true existence. This is very helpful, for example, our arising thoughts in daily life. As I mentioned yesterday, when afflictions arise, we feel the afflictions truly exist. We feel the external environment is so beautiful, and happiness truly exists as well. Naturally, we have these thoughts, and we have never examined what beauty actually is. What exactly are afflictions? We have never examined their inherent nature. When you finally examine them, it's just like chasing a rainbow. A rainbow looks very beautiful from afar, but when you actually get there, it's nowhere to be found. It is nothing more than a deceptive appearance. All the phenomena in this shared deluded world we inhabit are in their deepest nature just as false, even though to our perception this world feels utterly real. It's not just us who think this way. Even modern physicists believe that an atom contains a vast amount of space and its interior is mostly empty. If we magnify an atom to the size of a large stadium, the nucleus in the center would be like a tiny mosquito. The truly substantial matter inside is incredibly minute. Yet all of us believe everything before our eyes truly exists, holding on to such a deluded grasping. What scientists describe about matter can in some ways correspond to what we are discussing here, that self-arising and arising from other cannot be established. Scientists merely have a partial understanding of the external material world, but regarding the profound truth at the level of consciousness up to now they have not realized it. Therefore, while studying Madhyamaka, we should also see through this life. Actually, our current thoughts and actions are all illusory, but we are self-righteous, thinking that we humans are very wise and creative. We have always been self-righteous in this way. In reality, all of this can be destroyed. It's as if we are inside a fragile, illusory bubble that could burst at any moment. But because we take it seriously, temporarily speaking, this deluded net feels quite solid on a personal level. So through the method of Madhyamaka, we should pop this exceptionally beautiful bubble. All right, we will stop here for today.
Kirgana jirano chupai chupun zolen droja
Bandangara Badna Sodargye Bandangara Badna Sodargye Bandangara Badna Sodargye